Hello, it's James Brown back with more from all of the above. And I wanted to touch on two very recent articles in two of the most high profile outlets in America and talk about how both these outlets framed these articles because framing is something that's very that it's not common, it doesn't do it justice. Framing is something that every person who presents any kind of media does. Is framing is essentially what I'm doing right now. I'm shaping I'm giving you context for what I intend to present to you. And there are two articles in the last two well in the last couple of weeks. One was from yesterday, and one was the one on the screen right now. If you're watching the video of this, um, was a bit older, that were both very curious to me. This one was Barry Weiss's article. It was much ballyhooed about the intellectual dark web. And if you're familiar with Eric Weinstein or Brett Weinstein or watch Joe Rogan or listen to Michael Shermer, you may have encountered these folks. So whatever you feel about them is irrelevant, honestly. Bari makes a very interesting argument. I don't totally agree with the argument, essentially, um, but let me give you a bit more on what the intellectual dark web is, and then we can talk about how puzzling these images are. Well, the intellectual dark web is essentially, I would call it eh, a rough association of intellectuals who are engaging in this level of online discourse across YouTube channels and podcasts and alternative media. And these are mostly folks who are either half of them seem left of center, half of them seem right of center, and they're willing to tackle ideas that are uh, becoming increasingly controversial, like uh, biology, essentially, is a huge one. So, uh, one concept that I heard Heather Hying, who's mentioned in this article, she's married to Brett Weinstein, and was that at Evergreen State College that her that the levels of folks who declared themselves transsexual were incredibly high. It was apparently something around 30 or 40%. In It's not that it's impossible; it's that it's improbable, and it speaks to a level of sort of trying things on for size. It's not impossible. It certainly could be true, but even broaching that kind of idea got a backlash. Like, ooh, how dare you even question? How dare you question the sexuality of these folks? Even though, from a biological perspective, these 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 professionals who look at data and look at nature and then look at reality, and they're like, this is improbable. So that's just one example. Another example is essentially just Michael Shermer's. Um, I think a better example would be a Dave Rubin or Joe Rogan. While I don't consider them intellectuals so much, I consider them sort of truth seekers, sort of um, those who are curious. I would also say they're both pretty right leaning. I wouldn't call them lefties, but more sort of on the libertarian end. And they have these growing shows of high popularity that are diving in directions that mainstream media don't go. often giving intellectuals a large platform for the first time. And what what is interesting about how the New York Times presented this information was a it was an opinion piece. Barry Rice is an opinion writer, and it wasn't really presented like most opinion pieces. It was it was an extensively reported piece if you look at it, and what what's interviews upon interviews upon interviews, and that's fine. Only, well, why is it presented as opinion if it's extensively reported? That I know Barry Rice is an opinion writer. It's not that she doesn't have a journalistic pedigree, though, but it's presented as opinion, not a well researched, well thought out, well presented piece of information added in completely traditional means. But it was presented as opinion, which I found very strange. And then on top of that, we have the choices here of the imagery, which I found quite dismaying. It was as if they were trying to m- mar, for lack of a better word, these members of the intellectual dark web. It is a nebulous name, but but as if they were uh, not just people who are challenging uh, uh, relatively mainstream ideology. You could argue whether that ideology that's mainstream is correct or not, but that's a different conversation. But it displays them in this sort of darkened, artistic, distracting woods, um, a back to nature way, in a very very kind of um, distracting. I think is the word I'd like to land on, as if they had, as if the imagery itself was commenting on the content itself. The content, the article itself couldn't stand alone. You couldn't just go with traditional imagery. That this is such an outlandish claim, which it isn't. That there's a separate world of people who don't quite fit the cable news or typical intellectual discourse, or maybe they have different ideas than some, that we want to display these folks in this sort of um eh, pretty pictures, but dark in stormy night photos. So one of the things that I found really really strange about that is that you have this you have the photography in the editors. I don't know how much Bari had uh, uh, connection with how those things are picked. Typically, within an organization the size of the New York Times, photography and even even things like headlines are not necessarily on the within the hands of the author of the piece. They're more in the hands of different parts of the organization, different, and it's felt as if they were commenting on the article itself while Bari was making her arguments in the article, which I thought were pretty well balanced. sympathetic in some ways, and at certain points, especially toward the end of the article, questioning whether what kind of credibility that some of these thinkers have. And I think some of the folks, I think you have a wide variety of folks listed as intellect members of the intellectual dark web. So I totally agree that, you know, if you considered Ben Shapiro and Brett Weinstein in the same club, you're gonna one is a essentially a pundit, and the other is a biologist. And as they speak on different issues, I mean, it's hard to give them both the same level of credence when one is essentially a pundit. A pundit is going to is is pretty much is similar to a polemicist. Essentially, they have a religion of thought, and they're going to stick to it without and they don't really need much to back it up. So so I found the article itself interesting in the thoughts well put together, but the imagery distracting and trying to depict a larger perspective or different perspective on the text itself, instead of starting with the text and creating the imagery based on the text. This felt like the opposite. It was like the imagery commenting on the article itself, which is strange and uncommon to opinion pieces, places at like the New York Times. And another interesting article, uh, in a moment of framing that I found quite a moment of framing that I found quite interesting was this a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. Uh, the financial crisis may have hit the '80s generation the hardest. Fed research finds wealth levels 34% below what they would be if the last recession hadn't occurred for those born in the '80s. So there's a couple of things. Just to admit my own bias here, I was born in the '80s. So it caught my eye simply because of that. Uh, and then I started to look at the imagery in it. This one's a little tougher in that there's a paywall, and I'm not a Wall Street Journal subscriber. But what you see in the imagery in this article is essentially George H.W. Bush, Barbara Bush, Nancy Reagan, and Ronald Reagan in 1985, and I was like, huh, that's interesting. And then I kind of just like I started going through the article. I'll read a bit of it to you. The children born in the Ronald Reagan's Morning in America era could be on track to become the last recession's lost generation, new research from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis says. Americans who entered the world in the 1980s are at substantial risk of accumulating less wealth over their lifespans than members of previous generations. That report's author said, not only is their wealth shortfall in 2016 very large in percentage terms, but the typical 1980s family actually lost ground in relative terms between 2010 and 2016, a period of rapidly rising asset values that buoyed the wealth of older cohorts. The article goes on to say that Fed research finds as 2016, as of 2016, those born in the 1980s had wealth levels 34% below what they would be absent the financial crisis in its aftermath. In comparison, people born in the 1970s had wealth levels that were 18% under where they should have been, and those folks born in the 1960s were down 11%. Now, all the facts here are rock solid. I mean, I went and followed up and went through the report, and I can't question where the facts are here. But the thing that I found puzzling is why is Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Barbara Bush on this article? What do the Reagan look? The long tail effects of presidencies vary depending on the actions they take. But boy, is it a stretch to blame the downfall of our economy on the Reagans and H.W. Bush. You could argue George W. Bush. You could argue Bill Clinton. You could argue how Barack Obama handled it. You can't really blame it on folks who weren't in power for 25 years, 25 to 30 years before the financial crisis. It's it's another thing where the images are conflicting with the story itself and the facts on the table, and it got me thinking, why why are they taking this tact? It's not like the Wall Street Journal is a conservative, is a liberal rag. It's a conservative paper. It's definitely a conservative paper. It's not only owned by the Murdochs, it's had a long history of being a conservative paper. It's not like they have an agenda against those cats. Like, in this case, it could essentially be carelessness. It could be someone just looking for some kind of hook to make the article stand out in the noise. And I think that's something that I think is increasingly harmful with these kinds of articles. Um, in the approach to journalism today, that it's not that they're worried about how we can make this thing go viral instead of how can we present this in a way that's true to the text and ideas that are being presented. And that is horrifying on a number of facts. In fact, I'd say the biggest element of this that's truly, truly, truly terrifying is that if we're basing the imagery and information around articles based on what will help it reach the largest audience possible, we're essentially continuing to devalue the content itself. The content itself doesn't matter. It could contradict the content as it does in both pieces. And it won't quite matter. It's about getting the hook. It's about getting the audience so that they can see the ads. And I it makes me continue to worry about the history and and the future of these outlets and how they present things to us. I find it very strange, and I don't know what the answer is. Both of these outfit outlets have paywalls, and they rely on their paywalls, but they also rely on ads. So it's not like they can stop relying on trying to get traction with their articles. but it does smack of a level of contempt for the product. It reminds me of something very interesting that David Simon said in an interview with Bill Moyers. Had to be 10 years ago, maybe more, that newspapers saw the newspaper management saw uh, saw the content itself, the articles, as the stuff that ran around the ads, instead of the other way around. Instead of the ads, the stuff that ran around the content. Their priorities continue to be fucked up, and I think these examples are just two of the latest and two of a continuing crush of examples of how in modern journalism our priorities are out of whack. For now, I'm James Brown. I good you good night.